Avatar, Meher Baba, Ki J. I must confess I feel a little bit apprehensive. I'll give you a psychological explanation for this stupid thing later in my talk. But I shouldn't be apprehensive at the moment. What makes me nervous, I suppose, is the fact that one hears rumours about these oral sessions that are held here. One hears wild stories about a locked cabinet in the archives somewhere. Just to prove my point, I'll tell you that you can look through the archive catalogue and you won't find one mention of that wonderful talk, Blushing in Balmain by George Mackay. And even juicier, there's an anonymous talk given called Freudian Days in DY. No mention in the catalogue. Well, having proved my point, I want to thank Michael and other members of the archive team, Jeanette particularly, for organising this and taking advantage of that small window in time where old age has disinhibited me to some extent, and yet I haven't quite reached the time when I'm packed into the wallet and darkness and disappear. A venerable tradition, I suppose, you'd have to say, a venerable tradition of giving testimonies. I was brought up an evangelical. Testimonies were commonplace, saved in the blood of the Lamb. I was lost, now am I found. So true. This is not intended to be a testimony in any sense. It's, I find testimonies tend to be both over-varnished and over-egged, to mix my metaphors. But I still, of course, have to decide on a persona to use. Should I be that sweet, biddable ingenue? Or, you like that one? Yeah. Or should I be that sooky mother's boy? Or should I be one of the lovable old boys? Or that clever academic splitter of hairs and dropper of quotations? We all choose what to present. The unvarnished truth is beyond all of us. On mature reflection, I've decided to be conservative householder rather than promiscuous guru chaser. And of course, you can see perhaps just how deeply grained my suburban instincts are by the fact that I've moved to live in Woombye Bottom. So, this suburban lad, unlike, of course, many of my colleagues who, in their salad days, enjoyed many of the thrills of the fringes of counterculture, its liberation from convention. But I was brought up in privilege and security, suburban lower middle class. I'm the only son of doting parents. From an early age, I was completely useless at everything except reading. My dear mother read to me by the hour, and she was a very good reader. I never had the same patience with my own brats, of course, but I'd still enjoy the solitary pleasures of reading. Since reading at the age of 8, most of the collected works of Dickens, and by the time I was 11, reading Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. That's just a little plug. I give little plugs now and then just to show you, this is not a testimony, but an example of a subgenre of what strange fish Barber catches in his net sometimes. Well, from a very early age, I was most fortunate in being sent to Sunday school. I've seen Sunday school described as the one institution that turns more people off God than anything else, but not me. I always loved the narrative skills of all those great biblical stories and those pretty pictures that in infant Sunday school they cut out for you and stamp the back of your hand with other nice ones. But of course, on a more serious level, growing up in suburban Sydney, you were really growing up in a very barren cultural desert where the local church was your only avenue to music, to great language, to idealism, and to gals. My ordinary schooling took place, primary school wasn't too bad, but after that, because of its propinquity, I was sent to Manly Boys High School, usually referred to as Shacktown, sometimes called Shocktown. And that was a place where real learning just didn't take place. It was law and order was kept with difficulty. Vast numbers of the local boys were sent there unwillingly. Most of them left when they were 15. Hardly anyone got through to the school certificate, and then almost no one to the higher school certificate or leaving certificate. So that there'd be 15 boys in the final year and about 600 in the first year. My life in Sunday school kept the flame alive. I never doubted for a moment that Jesus was real and that Jesus loved me. Have never lost that faith at all. On that very simple level. I adopted my parents' cultural values, which meant that, unlike some of my colleagues, I don't think I've ever heard the Who's or the Rolling Stone or things like that. My passions when I was an adolescent were Bing Crosby and the Andrews Sisters, and Mozart's operas. But that rescued me from any dilly-dallying with the hit parades of the day. My life of acceptance of the church teachings went on very smoothly until almost the end of school. And it was then that I went to the Sydney Showground and listened to Billy Graham. I took a whole lot of parishioners along with me. I saw how Billy Graham's crusade was a direct descendant of Hitler's rallies, of how he preyed upon adolescent guilt, how he used mass responses to draw people to some sort of spurious commitment to transforming and so on. And I was so upset that I vomited. It was a far cry from the harmless world of idealistic curates and sweet house parties that I had been brought up in. After that, I went on to Sydney University. Luckily, I failed Med 1 before I had an opportunity to kill anybody. And I managed to more or less withstand the malign influences of Sydney University for the years that I was there. I switched to the arts degree. I thought I was searching for wisdom. Philosophy was dominated by empiricism and rhetorical studies. Psychology was full of stimulus response behaviorism and Freudian nonsense. History, I did ancient history, was, of course, almost everything we were taught then has been negated by recent discoveries, but history was good. And English, by great stroke of providence, I failed English. I moved on to Sydney University, which it really was a mecca for me, with its, to me, wonderful Gothic architecture and a temple of learning in every sense. But I started off foolishly doing medicine, which in those days they failed 2/3 of all students in Med 1, and I was one of the 2/3 that failed. I hadn't really developed study techniques when I was at school at all. Plus, I was always choosing myself what I wanted to do rather than follow anything that I should be doing. That's been an inherent quality of my psyche. So I started off failing Med 1, luckily before I could kill anybody. And from then on, I switched over to an arts degree that I felt would lead me to a wide range of wisdom before I studied theology. So I cruised along, not doing much work in the arts degree, but reading voraciously and enjoying just the utter leisure that being at university gave me. I didn't have that social life that many people have, being quite narcissistic and withdrawn sort of person, but I was very happy to be living in the sheltered atmosphere of my parents and going to enjoying the freedom of the university. So, as I said, I managed to withstand the malign influence of Sydney University. It was dominated by secularism. It was dominated by skepticism. It was dominated by an arrogant empiricism that made any sort of transcendental approach to life scorned. And apart, there was religion in the university, but it was dominated by the Evangelical Union, which I joined. Foolishly, I should have joined the student Christian movement, which was a lot more liberal and learned, but I never did. So, at the university, we were brainwashed into a most limited view of reality. And the arrogance of my teachers amazes me as I look back on it. Anyway, I had by the time I finally graduated, I'd had 5 years at the university, thanks to my indulgent parents who were supporting me. I had a scholarship, but still it cost them a lot. And I then started on my real career. On the border of the university was a theological college, an Anglican theological college called Moore College, and which offered traineeships for the ministry, the Anglican ministry. And there I had a very happy year. I enjoyed the companionship of other holy young men. The place was packed because they'd all been converted by flaming Billy Graham. But of course I made the mistake of being frank about my difficulties. Now my difficulties were that I had trouble accepting the absolute authority of the Holy Scriptures. That the Anglican diocese was trying to return to what they saw as the purity and simplicity of 1st century AD Christianity, which meant accepting totally the inerrancy of the Scriptures and to returning to what they also saw as the purity of John Calvin and other scriptural exegetes. So that these were this sort of puritanical intellectualism saw my attitude, which I'd been shaped by German theologians. I'd read the autobiography of Saint Teresa. I knew that I couldn't deny the sort of experiences of the Virgin that she'd had. I couldn't negate other great traditions. I made no secret of it. I embraced what would have been called in the 18th century latitudinarianism, wide, liberal approach to religion. Anyway, at the end of the year, I hadn't passed all my exams, but I was called in by the principal. This is 1961, I think. That figure, yeah. I was called in by the principal and told I was expelled from the college. I think this was, my life had been very sheltered, apart from being rebuffed by my first girlfriend. This was the biggest blow my life had suffered. So tears ran down my face. I couldn't believe what he was saying. But in fact, they were way overcrowded, and they wanted to get rid of anybody who showed symptoms of high church or liberalism. But they said I was being dismissed, expelled, because of my spiritual pride, which meant my refusal to obey the authority of the Holy Scriptures. So even I didn't even have the pleasure of doing things with choir boys or anything. I got expelled for heresy, and I managed to. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't qualified to be a teacher because I didn't have teaching subjects in my degree much, and I was devastated. So I signed up to be a catechist in a church, which was sort of unpaid, fully part-time job of working all weekend, Monday night, Wednesday night, Friday night, fellowship, Sunday school, superintendent, everything else in my weekends. And I then became a school teacher. I could become a casual school teacher since I had 1 year of physics left over from my failure in medicine. So I had, on the strength of 1 year in physics, I became a science teacher. And then, fortunately, the year after that, I became an English teacher, which I really enjoyed. But by that stage, I was married to one of the parishioners, and we went on the Oriana to Europe, and this was 1963. And it was a marvellous time to go to Europe. Of course, it was the time of the Beatles and miniskirts and all the paraphernalia that swinging London had in the 1960s, a society totally transformed by female contraception, you could say, and a feeling of total freedom that was felt amongst the young. But of course, for me, I ignored the whole thing, and I used to spend all my weekends with Nicholas Pevner's book, the books of the counties of England, in my pocket, going around looking at beautiful houses, reading more voracious reading, and travelling all over the place, going to all the lovely forests and dells and ancient houses that I could possibly go to, and also going to all the concerts and all the films, all the continental films, all the wonderful concerts in the festival hall. I had an incredibly intense time of European culture. And as you can see, my inner focus was no longer really on the divine, but it had been replaced by a sort of idolatry of what I saw as the best of European culture. And so I was there. I had a rotten school teaching job while I was there in a comprehensive school in London. So that kept me honest. But I was there for 2 years and then did a flip round the continent in my Mini Minor and then came back to Australia. Been away 2 or 3 years. And there, following my deeply ingrained suburban instincts, I went into suburban living and I bought a house. This is what you used to do in those days. As soon as you could, you bought a house and settled down and got a job. And I got a job with the Vocational Guidance Bureau, 9 to 5 job, which was totally routine. I discovered when I got back to Australia that no one was interested in the gloss of culture that I'd coated myself with. No one wanted to hear about my experiences. We went back into that suburban life, and I realised I had to do something, or else I was in trouble psychologically. So I then decided that the only solution for me was to go back to the university as an evening student and take English. People said, "Why are you doing that?" Well, I said, I want to do English 1, English 2, English 3, English 4, the honours year, and then I want to do a PhD, and then I want to be an academic. Well, with my academic record and with the difficulty of doing that, it sounded just one more illusion on my part. But anyway, that's exactly what I did. And I managed to fulfill those fantasy aims. That took 4 years. And I ended up with equivalent of first-class honours and a scholarship to do a PhD. I was thrilled to bits. I had a lovely little study right up in the clock tower at Sydney University, looked down on the quadrangle. wow. I was so euphoric, in fact, that I started to do a bit of flirting around and ended up abandoning my wife, and I didn't have any kids, but abandoning my wife and going off with Adrian, my second wife, and having 4 kids, and then becoming an academic myself after those 4 years, getting a job in Armidale, which looked pretty good for kids especially. However, things were happening to me much more than those courses that I had to do and that 9-to-5 job. So I was pretty busy, but I still felt the primacy of the inner life. That religion, when it came down to it, was a matter of feeling the spirit within, finding the truth that was inherently there within one, rather than subscription to any particular dogma or faith. You could say, I suppose, I was much more into Janic outlook on things than anything bhakti in my approach to life. And it was the beginning of the New Age, of course, when people were just discovering smoking dope in Australia. It didn't really start till the beginning of the 70s. Or no, I'm going, about 68. People were smoking dope, taking acid, and getting into a lot of traditional way out religious stuff in ways. So I was fortunate because we went to New Zealand, and there I came across Geoff. There was a Geoff group of lovely old ladies who were in Auckland, who were dressing in bombazine and lace and wearing lavender perfume, but were going through the wonderful stories of Uspensky and Nichol's 5-volume thing on his group meetings and so on. So I realised, good heavens, Geoff is right. Not just me, but everybody is really basically asleep. We're asleep, but there is a possibility of waking up. That was the whole stimulating Geoff stuff. I read a little book, Psychological Evolution of Mankind by Uspensky, and yeah, I've never seen psychology like that before. Wow, it's real. And then that led me on to other things. I discovered, that culture that had seemed an end in itself in England was really only provincial. That the real world culture was somehow, in the New Age, just being rediscovered for us by all sorts of wonderful things that were happening. The first Tibetan lamas were turning up in the States. The first Sufi groups were being formed in England. The first real Vedantic teachers were teaching away in California. And wonderful New Age gurus, some of them enthusiastic but rather ill-informed, but others who were quite, what seemed to me, and still does in a way, religious geniuses, like Darfri John and Rajneesh. I have real qualifications, especially about Rajneesh now, but anyway, that was suddenly all bursting upon me, and so it was wonderful to have those windows on the world, because when we went up to Armidale, again, it was a very provincial society in Armidale. There was nobody else in the university who was interested in these fields at all. And I went along to the Armidale Municipal Library, and there I found two books. One was the Everything and the Nothing, and the other was Donkin's book. And they'd been put there, of course, by Gladys Hewitt, that's right. May she rest in peace. Gladys Hewitt must have put them there. Probably for a couple of years they stayed there before they got chucked. But that was a great discovery for me. And so that's, I suppose, when you can say that things started to warm up.
What year was that?
So this takes us through. Let's think. It takes us through to, I think, about the first time I had a sabbatical leave, and went to Europe again. I had a couple of lovely years wandering around in Europe, and 6 months in Sri Lanka, lots of Buddhism. I even got a chance to go to India, and like a fool, I had a friend who really knew India inside out spiritually, and he said, "What do you want from India?" And I said, "Oh, I'd like some scenery." He said, "Are you sure?" "Yeah, we'll go for scenery." "Okay," he said, "well, go up to Kulu and Manali, up there. Yeah, that's the best scenery in India." That's what I did. Almost killed the family. It was a hairy trip in those days. 36 hours in a bus along mountain roads and so on. Kids were only small. We went up, and it was the most wonderful scenery. Hundreds of year-old cedars, trees, and air like champagne and gushing streams, and well, but that's what I got from India at that stage, foolishly. Yeah. Anyway, I found, I suppose the next interesting thing that happened to me is the fact that I ran into John Iwai's sister, who is a link in our chain to Barbara, and I didn't realise at the time, but I joined up with a wonderful chain of transmission that went back through John to Lee, and then through Lee to the great Paul Smith, and then from Paul Smith to what's his name? Robert Dreyfus, yeah, and then right back to the Mundaley. We've galloped on now to about 1984. A lot had happened, of course. I mean, my voracious reading had kept up. In my academic career, I chose those authors to lecture on that other people didn't want, but which had a spiritual dimension to them. Shakespeare, of course. Shelley, the Cambridge Platonists. George Eliot, T.S. Eliot, the German idealist tradition. George MacDonald, C.S. Lewis. People that had at least an inkling of the sacred tradition and left it in their literature. I'd also been able to put myself in contact with Buddhism. Now, what had happened to me in '84 was that I had a sabbatical, and the family planned to go to Rome, and I said, no, I want to go to India, but I want to make it a pilgrimage. And I made an inner prayer. God, please lead me to you when I make this a pilgrimage. So I had a whole list of ashrams to visit. Muktananda and others right near the top of the list. And just then I ran into John I.Y., who said to me, "Oh, yeah, they're all good places, but have you heard of Mehrabad?" And it's a good place to visit, a very nice, safe place to visit. So I said, "Oh, you're right." I put it on the bottom of the list. I put Mehrabad on, and then I went on pilgrimage to India. So this is the end of '84, and strange things happened, as have happened to many in the subcontinent. I flew to Mumbai. Plane gets in about 1 a.m. Mumbai time. It's pitch dark, it stinks. I immediately felt I had something wrong with my throat, high temperature, bloody plane, and got out. I had 2 enormous suitcases I could hardly carry with all our winter clothes. We're on our way to Europe. I staggered out. 2 chaps came in and said, "We'll carry those for you," and then led me, I had to follow because they had the suitcases, out into this dark parking lot where they stood over me for money, and then got a taxi for me from their friend with a couple of blokes in it. And I'd made another mistake. I went to the Indian consulate in Sydney before I left and asked for the cheapest hotel in Mumbai. Well, that's what I got. And so I hopped into this taxi, feeling a great deal of disquiet about what was happening. And off we went. Well, you know, you expect, on Sydney time, you're expecting the dawn, but the dark continues. And we went, seeming like hour after hour, through Mumbai, with all these hundreds of little fires burning and smoke, and then all these figures lying on the footpaths, thousands of people lying on the footpaths with rats scampering around on them. And I felt, this is hell. I've come to hell. And it was, and I was feeling really sick. Anyway, we finally got to the hotel about dawn, and got rid of these blokes for an exorbitant sum. And then the hotel was still closed, of course, and it was on Marine Drive. The traffic was unbelievable, even at 6 in the morning. Finally got into the hotel, got shown up to a huge room, filthy room, basin covered in blood and shit. Feeling absolutely terrible, put myself on the bed, lay there for hours. 5 minutes had passed. My whole sense of identity and my whole sense of passing time had gone. Tried to stagger out and find a bus stand to go to one of these ashrams. Bloody Indians gave me wrong directions. "Yes, sir, yes, along there, sir, yes, yes." Never found it. Tried again. No bus came. Took a taxi to Victoria Terminus. Got into an interminable queue, which then couldn't understand what they were saying, and went back home again. I couldn't even eat an orange or anything. I was feeling terrible. Went back to Victoria Terminus the next day, and I found I was in a queue to get to Pune. So I went to Pune. I looked up my list, and there John I.Y. had said, yes, via Pune. I said, oh, well, here we are. So you can catch a bus from Pune. So after a considerable mucking about, I got on a red bus to Naga, and worried, of course, all the time, because the suitcases, they put them up on the top of the bus. Every stop I kept getting out to have a look, and no one had pinched my suitcases. And we got to Naga, and I got out. I had no idea where I was going. I just, lugging my 2 suitcases, staggered up the pavement and blundered into the Barber Centre. And they said, oh, yes, good. Gave me a rickshaw, and off I went to Maribad. As soon as I got to Maribad, of course, there was loving kindness, because I was quite ill by this stage, and there was Dr. Anne, there was Janet, there were other angelic mother figures, and I was immediately looked after. But it took me a good week to recover. But I spent the week reading Love Alone Prevails in the library with that lovely fat man who used to run the library, the big hugger. You know, the man who gave everybody the big hug. You remember Narnika, don't you? Yeah. Well, yeah, Narnika, he was a very beautiful uncle type of thing. Anyway, the week passed, and I did all the usual things that you do there, and felt pretty good. Then I decided I can't stay in this place I've come to find God, and I've got to give God a chance, go looking. So I caught a bus to Aurangabad, and as we left, we went past Seclusion Hill, and I suddenly had this terrible pang. What am I doing? It's Seclusion Hill from a new angle from the road where the bus was on, and there it was. What am I don't want to leave. I want to go back to Seclusion Hill. Anyway, I persevered. Of course, as soon as I got to a hotel in Aurangabad, I got the fever and dysentery again. But I stuck it out and went to the caves, both lots of caves, and I went and the Valley of the Saints and various other things before I finally caved in, and with my tail between my legs dashed back to Maribad and spent the rest of my month in Maribad enjoying meeting Erich and Mani, feeling deep veneration for meeting Mayra, being given a bit of Barber's hair, which I lost, and so on and so on. So when I left India, which I had to do at the end of the month, just before Amatiti, I took with me Barber's discourses and also Bosnia's discourses, and headed back to Europe with a farewell present from Mumbai, in that I went to the Mumbai club and had curried prawns, and you can imagine what the farewell present was. Anyway, so off I went to another agreeable year in England and France, but mainly in France this time, with reading Barber's discourses. The family showed no interest. They were used to my promiscuous guru hopping, and so I suppose what gradually happened is that I never denied Barber, but Barber somehow became, to use a technical term, Deus Otiosus, the God who's more or less the big high God who's behind everything, but if you want something done, you apply to the local saint. You know, he's at a distance. I lost the feeling of intimate contact with Barber, which is always very hard, I think, for anybody, a Barber lover or anybody who's in isolation, kept up without any rituals, without any. You've got the three prayers, of course, but you don't have a reinforcement coming in all the time. Just to return for a moment to that moment when my life became particularly interesting again with a visit to Mehrabad. Whilst I was at Mehrabad, I gave a talk, and I met Marnie, and she said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Oh, I'm a lecturer." And "What are you interested in?" And I said, "Oh, I'm interested in Shakespeare." And Marnie said to me, "How wonderful! Oh, that's marvellous! You're interested in Shakespeare. Oh, I love Shakespeare too." And I said, "Well, yes, I'm the first person really who has discovered what the true meaning of Shakespeare is." "Oh, how wonderful! Yes," she said, a little taken aback. And I said, "If you're interested, I can give an hour's lecture on Hamlet at the drop of a hat." And she said, "Well, that would be lovely to have you do that. I would be so interested." And I said, "All right, well, I'll do it tomorrow if you like, when everybody's there at Mehrabad." "Oh, wonderful." Well, the next day came. I think I had a copy of Hamlet in my back pocket, and I turned up Mundley Hall in Mehrabad, and Marnie wasn't there. She's busy elsewhere. But she sent poor Erich to listen to me. Erich and a dozen other unfortunate souls. So I gave them an hour's talk on the spiritual meaning of Hamlet. At the end of it, Erich came up to me. He just said one phrase: "Quite remarkable, quite remarkable." Poor man, it wasn't exactly his cup of tea. But it was my cup of tea. It was my passion to see that the thing that made sense of all 37 of Shakespeare's plays was the fact that they were all about the utter importance of real love, real selflessness, as against self-centeredness and power-seeking, and as against even understanding. All the forms of ego-assertiveness that are shown, Shakespeare explored in so many different ways. Comedy, histories, tragedy, and then the romances, experimenting in so many different ways to get over the fact that only by surrendering that willful personal self, only by coming to a sacrifice and giving up of things, can you authentically become the real person. Sometimes, as in Hamlet's case, of course, it's glimpsed not long before he dies, but he totally accepts what is to happen, come what may. You know, it's that same sort of acceptance that you see at the heart of Upasani Maharaj, and it's a wisdom that wasn't quite focused for Shakespeare in his early plays, but became more and more focused. And Shakespeare, of course, was facing a world that seemed to be nonsensical and at a great distance from Providence, because just when he and other enlightened people were waiting for Henry, the son of King James, to succeed, because he was interested in religious tolerance and inner life. They'd been grooming him with various tutors and things to take over in an enlightened fashion. He caught fever and died. And there was nobody else to take charge of things. And they were facing a world where patriotism, in the form of Catholics versus Protestants, us versus them, was going to ravage the whole of Europe right through the 17th century. Dogmatism was going to triumph. Everybody who had a wider view of things would have to keep a low profile, and that must have been extremely hard for him to face. I became convinced that he had a group of people around who had a much wider view of things, seeing the horrors in recent British history of what the Protestants did to the Catholics and vice versa, and that these people had to be so careful because anything that seemed to go against the orthodoxy, it was a capital crime. So he had to be careful what he said in his plays and what the group did. Anyway, it fitted all the plays, and that's, I forgot to mention that I wrote that book on Shakespeare, which has been read by a very select few. And I had to publish it at my own expense, which makes people even more sceptical about it, and which I did. I put my ideas on each play there, but it's a long time ago now. This is back in the 80s when I finished that book, and when I reread it, with Tian's enthusiasm for it, of course, a big help too, it still seems to me to be the best view of Shakespeare to take. And this is not going to carry much weight with this, with my Barber audience, but I sent a copy of the book to Darfrey John, who was flourishing at that stage, and he told his followers to read the book because it was the best thing that had ever been written on Shakespeare. And Darfrey John, whatever reservations you might have about him, was one of the great minds of the 20th century. So that was enough. I didn't need approval from any academics, and I never got any approval because nobody even read it. And it seemed only nutcases go around saying that they know what Shakespeare's all about. Yeah. So that's what happened. That talk I gave in Mehrabad brought together the spiritual and the literary side of things very much, and that's what dominated the rest of my teaching at the university, which annoyed my colleagues no end, because they not only were they, when I started being an academic, they were humanists of one sort or another, but they gradually became deconstructionists of one sort or another. In other words, they became total skeptics about being able to find truth within oneself. Truth is a matter of language, and language is always deceptive with meanings postponed and so on. So that not only did they lose access to the spiritual traditions, but they lost access to the humanist tradition as well. And it's a great they more or less killed the whole discipline of teaching English in universities. It's probably Sydney University, there'd only be about a tenth of the people who used to be going in it, and there's hardly any academics still teaching literature. It's all communication skills and stuff. But it's when I started lecturing, I first started lecturing in Armidale in 1971, end of 1971, and I then found that I was facing a total. I expected when I got to the university, I thought, there'll be other people into Sufism, there'll be other people into Buddhism. No, there weren't. Academia had just dried up in a way. People were so busy with their careers, with this having to specialise to make a career and so on, that they weren't themselves getting a wide overview of the traditions. Nor did they realise that Western tradition of literature didn't even begin to make sense unless you saw it as allied to the great spiritual traditions. And, of course, takes us immediately back to Barber's beads on one string. But it is... Barber certainly didn't tell us to chuck the beads away and keep the string, although in one metaphorical way he is the string, but joining these things together. But it's the deeper one goes through the different traditions, of course, the closer they draw to each other as they draw closer to the centre of things. So I've always been an isolated person apart from family, and I was just as isolated in that setup in Armidale as we moved from the 80s through to the 90s. One thing that I did start discovering, which I hadn't realised before, was the riches of the Tibetan and Chinese traditions. We were most fortunate in that Buddhist teachers who were good practitioners themselves and had a certain mastery of themselves were able... There wasn't a great popularity for these things back in those days, in the 80s, in Australia. So they would come up to Armidale, where we would mount meetings for them, advertise them at the university, and 2 or 3 students would turn up and no staff to meet really interesting lamas and other people who gave wonderful talks. That's the way it went. And also I felt, knowing my own lack of progress in many ways, I felt that as well as Barber, I needed a living teacher in some ways, and that's what this contact with these Tibetan lamas produced. That feeling of having these teachers face to face, which was extremely comforting, and of course it was life changing for all my 4 daughters, and my ex-wife, who all became very devout Buddhists, and who all of whom are still very devout practicing Buddhists, which is a great comfort to me. Anyway, at this point, I said my story became interesting when I went to Mehrabad. Well, at this point in my life, my story becomes very interesting in that I met Tian. And she enters our story from this point, which was 1992. Uh, I've decided to spare you all the details of the folly and the passions that our meeting entailed. The significant fact of the matter was that life was not easy for us for a number of years, and we weren't all that happy in Armidale, where a certain amount of ostracism went on. And then, lo and behold, John Isaac's sister comes into the story again. John and Jeanette needed a babysitter for the cat in Mayo Road. And I suddenly thought that would be a really good break for Tian. I'd been to Avatar's abode a couple of times back in the 1980s after my trip to Maribad. I came up here. I enjoyed being in the place very much. I wasn't all that impressed by the local rednecks. They weren't really rednecks, but that's how I saw them at the time. So it took me years to begin to recognise the virtues of the ordinariness of the Barber community, of their everyday lives, of the unshowy nature of their work, of their kindness and compassion, and the lack of affectation, and the solid link that they had with Barber. And I hadn't realised that at first, but I still felt, well, that we should come to the rescue of the eye-wise cat and come up here, which we did. So we came up, and for a life-changing experience, really, because we started off in the pilgrim quarters here, and then I said, oh, well, there's Barber's house is up the hill there, and we took Tian to Barber's room, and Tian's background is interesting here because she was brought up in a very conformist society in some ways, where although she was personally inclined to be rebellious herself, but she had an enormous pressure to regard religion as having been left behind by scientific materialism and being a way of exploiting people in the past through superstition. And that had cut her off from all the great Buddhist and Taoist and Confucian traditions of the past, which was seen as a clinging on to class exploitation. So when she came here and we became friends, she'd been a little taken aback by the fact that I went in for all this spiritual stuff, and but prepared to treat it with some respect. And we went to a couple of the Buddhist. She came to a couple of the Buddhist lamas, and she was impressed. But they were nice, wise people. But that was it. And lo and behold, as soon as she came up here, she suddenly felt an extraordinary affinity with Barber, and said in wonderment to herself, there is a God. God is real. There is an inner reality. There is something here. I feel it. And she felt not only in Barber's room, but in the whole temenos here. Temenos means a holy milieu of land and buildings and things. The sacred temenos that's gathered round this house of Barbara's here. She felt something that she hadn't experienced before. And so after 2 or 3 days in the Pilgrim Centre, we moved into Mayor Road and the Cat. And Tian used to get up about 4 o'clock in the morning, passionately reading God Speaks. Couldn't believe it. Doesn't happen to many people. And as she read, she became convinced that it was talking about an actual reality that she could feel. And I did a real double take because, as I said, Barbara had tended to no longer be an immediate devotional experience for me. And I was delighted and thought, and I too felt very close to Barbara at the same time. So it changed everything, and we decided that we'd been planning to go and lead a life of sophistication in inner city Melbourne suburbs. It was just before the prices went up down there. But we decided, blow it all, we'll stay here. Where else is this is the centre. This is the centre, not Melbourne. And so next thing we didn't have a great deal of money because of my divorce is fairly punitive, but we had enough to buy our little brick veneer box in Lower Woombye, and which we've loved ever since. It's beautiful suburbia. Just we're both suburban people. We like it. I've always, as I said before, I love suburban streets. Wandering. When you're a kid, of course, you get to know everybody on the locale, even the creeps on the block. You get to know, and I found humanity flourishes in the family atmosphere of suburbia, which even you could say Mayor Road has come into its suburban glory with all the kids there now too. Anyway, it's we moved out of Armidale, lock, stock and barrel came up here, and at first we thought, wow, a community will be supported and looked after and feted, and it didn't work out quite like that. People leave you very much to make your own way, and anyway, we were both a bit antisocial in some ways, but it's been a real support having the community here, and of course it's sort of I felt for a while useless when I came up here, but I then was given the job of looking after the library. Of course, if I could, if you look closely at this book, In Dust I Sing, you'll see that I should never be allowed near books. I don't treat them very well, but I do like books. And I thought some of the stuff that I wanted to say was, it's already been said far better than that in one of Francis's ghazals. Actually, the first time I had personal contact with a Barber lover with awareness was in Armidale, way back, early 80s, I don't know. But Adrian Rawlins was passing through town. Every now and then he travelled north. And he was visiting again John's sister. And he was there, and he was raving on about Hafiz. And I said, oh yes, I've read some Hafiz. I've read some of his ghazals. He looked at me, and when he wanted to emphasise something, he could. Ghazals! Ghazals, he said. And he shouted and shouted at the same word, ghazals! And, oh, right. Of course, in my snide way, I couldn't help thinking that what Adrian did when he got into someone's refrigeration was guzzle, guzzle, guzzle. I hasten to add, I became very fond of Adrian, and I realised the Falstaffian generosity of the man as he gave himself to life and totally believed in the divinity of his master and brought life and laughter to so many people. And but that was my first encounter with a Barber lover. Well, this is number 48 in Dust I Sing. If anyone asks for proof that God exists, let him disprove his own existence. Let him declare what makes his mind move. It's not for the lover to prove, but to be. God save him then from the slightest hypocrisy. For with that, he's both a witless fool and a liar. A green log smoking, making out it is a fire. Mind demands proof of what is entirely beyond mind. One day it will learn to sit still and not ask and find. Whatever one can say is but a figure of speech. Like the sun rises, the moon sinks, and the waves wash on the beach. Love delights in poetry and parables. Of itself it is sure. Mind demands the prose of logic because it is insecure. Let the demander question and sort, for trash is his treasure. The lover has another occupation, his beloved's pleasure. What a poem. Well, I think I'm getting pretty close to my closing peroration. Moore College were right. As well as being a narcissist, I was full of spiritual pride, but in a deeper level, I think, than they realised, and certainly not coming round to agree with their narrowness. I still feel just as strongly against the idolatry applied to any authority. There's no real distinction I realise, between large and small. The smallest acts of kindness or service can be just as important or more important than any great acts that show as dramatic and sacrificial. Barber shining through all our obscurations. It's not just that Barber is in everything. Everything's part of him. Everything is Barber. You're not liable to be guru idolatry if you start with that of widest intuitive premise of the divine, of the actual. But of course you have to keep the discipline of reminding yourself of it all the time. And it only gradually settles into being adopted in your own nature. I've gradually realised, being up here, that things are done rather than me choosing what should happen or what I should do. That simplicity and loving kindness are what really counts in the spiritual group. For me and for the group, I feel, up here, Barbara has kept reminding us of our shortcomings so that we don't, as a group, have spiritual pride, that we don't have a feeling that we are the chosen few. So I finish by affirming my innate hopelessness, my absolutely essential need for continual grace and guidance from our compassionate Father. As I've learnt from both literature and from Barber, the essential technique for humanity is the disabling of egotism. Even great literary figures like Shakespeare and Emily Dickinson have that same message, but without, of course, the living presence of the Lord, whatever tradition you're following. But unless you're following that sacred tradition where presence is affirmed by a great tradition of some sort, unless that happens, however much the truths are enunciated in literature, you finally end up saying, so what? Thank you for your patience, and Avatar Maya Baba Ki Jai. I should mention that on that initial voyage back in 1963, I think it was, to England, I mean, it was such an exciting thing for Aussies to do that. One moment you were kissing mum and dad goodbye on the wharf in Sydney Harbour, and the next moment you would go out through the heads with the drumming sound of the ocean liner and the open sea, and then a few days later you were heading for the exotic East, and this certainly the exotic East, as we've all learnt, is just such a teaching aid for us all in the 20th century. And when the thing Michael's referring to, the liner, as it got close to Colombo, there was a little fat Indian man called the Hully Gully Man. And the Hully Gully man came, and the Hully Gully man put on his show. So all the passengers gathered round in the ballroom in a complete circle with a polished floor like this. And the Hully Gully man came and did all these amazing things. But the thing that absolutely wowed everybody was that he seemed to have power over the process of life. He produced a mango seed. And did he play a flute? I can't remember what it did, but he played something and the mango seed sprouted. And there it was. Now, it's 360 degrees of sceptical Aussie tourists, materialists, thinking it's a vaudeville show. But nobody could understand it. And I had a friend, very intelligent friend, who was going over to do his PhD at Cambridge in maths, and he was shaken by it. And then when he got off the boat in Colombo, and no sooner did he walk from the ship into a little park, that a man came up to him and said, "I tell your fortune, sir. Please, you tell me. I've no money, I just tell you your fortune." And told him, incontrovertibly told him what his life had been up to this point, and made some predictions. So he was really, could not explain. He was brought, as I was to be, not in that trip, but in later trips, brought face to face with that. For human beings, reality is essentially a mystery. That was the lesson of the Hully Gully man. I was a searcher even back then, in 1956, just starting my arts degree. And I can remember being immensely impressed by a lovely Anglican Franciscan friar who was there. And I realised how somebody could display their sanctity just the way they drank a cup of tea from bone china. Of course, later on I realised, bullshit, Gunther, what you don't realise, you've just seen the impeccable manners of the English upper class. You've never seen anyone devour a little cupcake and a cup of tea in that exquisite way. But at the same time, somebody plastered Sydney University all over with posters of Mayor Barber, 56 meeting. And I thought, that sounds interesting, I'll go. I was only 18. And I lived in Balgowlah, which was only a bike ride really from Beacon Hill. So I decided to go. Well, as I've told many people in the story, my dad brought home a girly magazine, so I decided to stay home and read the girly magazine instead. So I missed that meeting. However, that's a lie, because to tell you the truth, I'm pretty sure I stayed home to read something. But my ephemeral experience of the girly magazine, I can't remember. It was to read something I decided to do instead of going to the meeting. So Barber had to haul me in. Barber had to spread his net wide, and he had to spread his net small mesh, and he had to show the greatest patience and indulgence to one who constantly wanted to assert his own indulgent freedoms and willpower. Because I did have this dream, and Barber was there writing, and I thought, this is a strange dream. And then in coloured lights came up 1956. I made no sense of it, but then when I was telling the dream to Tian, I suddenly realised, yeah, he knew of me in 1956. So there, Yeah. That's a pretty amazing dream. Yeah. It has been a source of you stupid bloody fool, why didn't you go? It was a sore point inside me for a long time before that dream. Yeah. I've enjoyed every moment. Thank you.
Me too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.